Sarah Evans gazed through the fogged window of the small house she shared with her daughters, Emily and Grace. The sun rose timidly over the Colorado horizon, but she could no longer see beauty in that dawn. Her hands, rough and bruised from excessive labor, trembled as she held the final collection letter. "Mama," Emily's soft voice, only 9 years old, broke the silence. Sarah quickly hid the paper and forced a smile. "Good morning, sweetheart." Grace, 2 years younger, appeared in the doorway with sleepy eyes. Both girls seemed so fragile, so small against the vastness of problems surrounding them. Margaret Clayton would arrive in 2 hours for another day of inhuman work. The miserable wage barely covered basic food, and debts accumulated like storm clouds. Sarah felt trapped in an invisible web, each thread representing a new humiliation, a new impossible demand to fulfill. In that moment, looking at her daughters, a desperate decision began to form in her mind. Perhaps it was madness. Perhaps it was the only way out. "Girls," Sarah said, her voice carrying a determination she didn't recognize in herself, "pack your things. Today we're leaving." The silence that followed was laden with hope and fear in equal measure. The morning sun climbed higher as Sarah stuffed their meager belongings into a worn canvas bag. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat echoing the urgency of their escape. Emily and Grace watched with wide eyes, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it. "Where are we going, Mama?" Grace whispered, clutching her only doll, a threadbare thing with button eyes that had been her father's last gift. Sarah knelt before her youngest daughter, smoothing the child's tangled hair. "Somewhere better, sweetheart. Somewhere we can be free." Emily, always the more perceptive one, stepped closer. Is Mrs. Clayton going to be angry? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Margaret Clayton would be furious. The woman had built her small empire on the backs of desperate people like Sarah, and she didn't tolerate defiance, but they would be gone before she arrived, and that was all that mattered now. "We won't be here for her to be angry with," Sarah said simply. They slipped out through the back door as the town began to stir. Sarah had planned this moment for weeks, studying the patterns of the neighborhood, knowing which houses would still have their curtains drawn, which dogs would bark. She led her daughters through narrow alleys and behind buildings, avoiding the main streets where familiar faces might spot them. The Colorado wilderness stretched endlessly beyond the town's borders. Sarah had taken what little money she had, barely enough for a few days' worth of food, and purchased supplies from different shops to avoid suspicion. A small knife, matches, a tin pot, dried beans, and hardtack. It wasn't much, but it would have to do that by midday. They had reached the edge of civilization. The mountains loomed ahead, purple and imposing against the cloudless sky. Sarah paused, letting the reality of their situation wash over her. Behind them lay a life of servitude and slow starvation. Ahead lay the unknown, dangerous, yes, but also infinite with possibility. "My feet hurt," Grace complained, her small hand tugging at Sarah's skirt. Sarah lifted her youngest daughter onto her back, feeling the child's arms wrapped trustingly around her neck. Emily walked beside them, her young face set with determination that reminded Sarah painfully of her late husband, David. He had possessed that same stubborn courage, that same refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. As the afternoon wore on, the familiar landmarks of their former life disappeared behind them. The air grew thinner, cooler. Sarah's legs ached from carrying Grace, but she pressed on, driven by a desperation that went beyond physical exhaustion. They followed deer trails and creek beds, staying away from the main roads where Margaret's men might follow. When evening painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, they made camp in a small grove of aspen trees. Sarah built a careful fire and prepared their first meal as fugitives, a thin soup of beans and water that tasted like freedom despite its poverty. "Tell us a story, Mama," Emily requested as they huddled together for warmth. Sarah looked up at the vast canopy of stars, brighter here than they had ever been in town. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice soft but steady. There were 3 brave travelers who set out to find a place where dreams could grow. As her daughters drifted off to sleep, Sarah remained awake, watching the fire burn low and listening to the wild sounds of the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in years, they were truly free. 3 days into their journey, Sarah realized they were lost. The mountain trails had given way to rolling hills, which gradually flattened into an endless expanse of scrubland and desert. What had seemed like a clear path westward now revealed itself as a maze of similar-looking ridges and dry creek beds. The Colorado wilderness was vast and unforgiving, and Sarah's limited knowledge of navigation proved woefully inadequate. "Mama, I'm thirsty." Grace whimpered from her perch on Sarah's back. The child's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Sarah's own throat felt like sandpaper, but she forced herself to smile. "Just a little longer, sweetheart. We'll find water soon." Emily walked beside them in silence, her young face pale and drawn. The girl hadn't complained once, but Sarah could see the exhaustion in every step, the way her small shoulders sagged beneath the weight of their situation. At 9 years old, Emily understood more than she should have to. Their water had run out the previous evening. Sarah had rationed it carefully, but desert travel demanded more than she had anticipated. The sun beat down mercilessly, and their lips were cracked and bleeding. The dry beans sat untouched in their bag, impossible to eat without water to soften them. A buzzard circled overhead, its shadow a dark omen against the bleached earth. Sarah pressed forward, driven by a mother's desperate determination. Every ridge promised salvation, water, shade, perhaps even other travelers who might help them. But each crest revealed only more of the same, endless, empty desert stretching toward a horizon that shimmered with false promises. "Look, Mama," Emily said softly, pointing to a cluster of rocks ahead. "Maybe there's shade there." The rocks formed a natural shelter, casting blessed shadows across the sand. Sarah lowered Grace gently to the ground, and all 3 collapsed in the relative coolness. The silence was profound, broken only by their labored breathing and the occasional whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. Sarah closed her eyes, fighting against the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had her desperation to escape Margaret Clayton led her daughters to an even worse fate? The questions tormented her, but she pushed them aside. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Mama," Grace's voice was barely audible, "are we going to die?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She gathered both daughters into her arms, feeling how fragile they had become, how the desert had already begun to claim them. "No, baby," she whispered fiercely. "We're going to survive. We're going to find help, and we're going to build a new life. I promise you." Emily looked up at her with eyes too old for her young face. "How do you know?" Sarah's throat constricted, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "Because we're Evans women, and Evans women don't give up." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah made a silent vow. She would find a way to save her daughters, no matter what it cost her, even if it meant sacrificing everything: her pride, her freedom, even her very soul. She would not let them perish in this wasteland. The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant storms. Somewhere out there, help existed. She had to believe that. She had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. The morning of their 5th day in the desert brought no relief from the merciless sun. Sarah's vision blurred as she stumbled forward, Grace clinging weakly to her back and Emily barely managing to put one foot in front of the other. Their water had been gone for 2 days, and their bodies were beginning to shut down. "Mama," Emily whispered, her voice cracked and desperate. I can't walk anymore." Sarah's legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees in the sand, Grace sliding from her back with a soft whimper. This was it. This was how their story would end: 3 skeletons in the Colorado desert, their bones bleached white by the unforgiving sun. But then she saw him, About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a large boulder, lay a man. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the dark stain of blood on his shirt and the wooden shaft of an arrow protruding from his shoulder. He wasn't moving. Stay here, Sarah croaked to her daughters, summoning strength she didn't know she still possessed. She crawled across the burning sand toward the stranger. As she drew closer, she could see that he was Native American. His long black hair matted with sweat and dust. His breathing was shallow, labored. The arrow had pierced deep, and infection was already setting in around the wound. But he was alive, and where there was life, there was hope. Sarah looked back at her daughters, then at the dying man before her. In that moment, a desperate plan formed in her mind, one that would either save them all or damn her soul forever. Sir, she whispered, gently touching his arm. Sir, can you hear me? The man's eyes fluttered open, dark and filled with pain. He studied her face with a mixture of confusion and wariness. My name is Sarah Evans, she said, her voice barely audible. I have two daughters. We're dying out here. The man tried to speak, but only a rasp emerged from his parched throat. Sarah took a shuddering breath. I can help you. I can remove that arrow, clean your wound, tend to your fever. But her voice broke. In exchange, I offer you my life. Take me as your slave. But please, please save my daughters. The man's eyes widened in shock, and something else. Was it compassion? I know the ways of healing, Sarah continued desperately. My mother was a midwife. I've seen arrow wounds before. Let me save you, and in return, give my girls a chance to live. Do with me what you will, but don't let them die in this wasteland. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind across the sand. Then, to Sarah's amazement, she saw tears gathering in the stranger's dark eyes. One rolled down his weathered cheek, cutting a clean path through the dust and grime. Thomas, he whispered, his voice like autumn leaves. My name is Thomas. Sarah felt her heart leap with desperate hope. Will you help us, Thomas? Will you? Save my daughters. Thomas struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his wounded shoulder. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strength that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his soul. I will not make you a slave, he said slowly, each word weighted with meaning. But I will save your daughters, and you will be free for the first time in days. Sarah Evans allowed herself to hope. With trembling hands, Sarah began the delicate work of saving Thomas's life. She had torn strips from her own petticoat to use as bandages, and her fingers moved with practiced precision despite her weakened state. Thomas watched her silently, his dark eyes never leaving her face as she worked. This will hurt, Sarah warned softly, gripping the arrow shaft. But the infection will kill you if I don't remove it. Thomas nodded once, then bit down on a piece of leather from his belt. Sarah pulled swiftly and cleanly, and the arrow came free with a wet sound that made Emily gasp from where she sat with Grace in the shade of the boulder. Blood flowed freely from the wound, but Sarah was ready. She pressed the cloth against the opening, applying steady pressure while Thomas's breathing grew ragged with pain. His body tensed, muscles corded with effort, but he made no sound. You're very brave, Sarah murmured, cleaning around the wound with water from Thomas's own leather pouch. Precious water. That meant life to all of them, as are you. Thomas replied through gritted teeth. Not many would approach a wounded stranger in the desert. Sarah's hand still for a moment. Not many would promise freedom to a desperate woman offering slavery. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, both shaped by suffering, both clinging to hope against impossible odds. As Sarah worked, Thomas began to speak in a low, measured voice. He told her of his people, the Northern Cheyenne, and of the land that lay beyond the desert where his tribe made their home. He spoke of cool streams and cottonwood groves, of children's laughter echoing across the plains. Is it far? Emily asked shyly, Having crept closer to listen, Thomas smiled at the girl, his stern features softening. 2 days' ride for a healthy horse, for days on foot for those who know the way. And you know the way? Sarah asked, carefully wrapping his shoulder with the makeshift bandages. I was born knowing the way, Thomas replied. My people have walked these lands for generations beyond counting. Grace, emboldened by her sister's example, approached with her worn doll clutched tightly against her chest. Are there other children there? Many children, Thomas assured her. They would like to meet you, I think. As the sun reached its zenith, Sarah finished tending to Thomas's wound. The bleeding had stopped, and though he was still weak from blood, loss and fever, she could see strength returning to his eyes. He tested his arm carefully, wincing but managing to move it. You have skilled hands, he said. My grandmother was a healer. She would have approved of your work. Sarah felt a flush of pride at the compliment, followed immediately by a pang of worry. The infection may still take hold. You need rest, clean water, proper food. Thomas struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but determined to stand. Then we must leave this place. My horse is hidden in the rocks beyond that ridge. If she has not wandered too far, we can reach my people before the fever takes me. He looked at Sarah and her daughters with an expression of quiet determination. You trusted me with your lives when you chose to help me. Now I ask you to trust me again. Come with me to my tribe. There you will find the safety you seek. Sarah gathered her daughters close, feeling their small hands slip into hers. Behind them lay only desert and death. Ahead lay the unknown, but with it, the promise of life. We trust you, Thomas, she said simply. Thomas's horse, a sturdy paint mare with intelligent eyes, had indeed wandered, but not far. She stood in a narrow canyon where a small spring bubbled up from between the rocks, providing the first clean water Sarah and her daughters had tasted in days. They drank deeply while Thomas spoke softly to his horse in his native language, running gentle hands along her flanks to check for injuries. Her name is Ayana, Thomas said, noting Emily's fascination with the animal. It means eternal blossom. In my tongue, Emily approached cautiously, extending her small hand toward the mare's velvet nose. Ayana snuffled softly, accepting the girl's touch with patient grace. She likes me, Emily whispered in wonder. She has good judgment, Thomas replied, a hint of warmth in his voice. The journey that followed tested them all. Thomas, though determined, grew feverish as the day wore on. Sarah walked beside him, one hand on his good arm to steady him when he swayed, while Emily and Grace took turns riding Ayana. The desert gradually gave way to rolling grassland, then to the foothills of distant mountains. As evening approached, Thomas began to speak more frequently in his native language, sometimes addressing the horse, sometimes muttering words that Sarah couldn't understand. His fever was rising, and she knew they were racing against Tom. How much farther? Sarah asked during one of their brief rests. Thomas looked toward the horizon where smoke rose in thin columns against the darkening sky. There, he said simply, my people's fires. But his strength was failing. Twice he stumbled, and the second time, he fell to his knees, breathing heavily. Sarah helped him to his feet, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. I can't make it, he admitted, his pride finally cracking. The fever, yes, you can, Sarah said firmly. Your people are waiting, your family. I have no family, Thomas said quietly. Only the tribe. Sarah felt a pang of recognition. Neither do we, only each other. Emily appeared at her mother's side. Mama, look. In the distance, riders were approaching, 3 figures on horseback, moving with purpose across the grassland. Thomas raised his head, squinting into the twilight. Swift Eagle, he breathed. He found us. The lead rider, a young man with a face both stern and kind, reached them first. He dismounted quickly, speaking rapidly in Cheyenne to Thomas, who responded weakly. The conversation was brief but intense, with frequent glances towards Sarah and her daughters. Finally, Swift Eagle turned to Sarah. His English was accented but clear. Thomas says you saved his life. He saved ours, Sarah replied honestly. Swift Eagle nodded slowly, then helped Thomas onto his horse. You are welcome among the Cheyenne, he said to Sarah. Thomas has spoken for you. You will be protected. As they rode the final distance to the village, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The fires grew closer, and she could make out the silhouettes of teepees against the star-filled sky. Somewhere ahead lay a new life, a chance for her daughters to grow up free and safe. But she also knew that entering this world would change them forever. They would no longer be just Sarah, Emily, and Grace Evans from Colorado. They would be something new, something she couldn't yet imagine. Thomas, semi-conscious but still clinging to Swift Eagle's horse, had kept his promise. He had brought them home to a home they had never known they needed. The village drums began to beat in the distance, welcoming them into the heart of the Cheyenne Nation. The Cheyenne village was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. Dozens of teepees stood in careful arrangement around a central fire, their painted buffalo hides glowing golden in the firelight. Children paused in their games to stare at the newcomers, while women looked up from their work with curious but cautious eyes. The air smelled of sage smoke, roasted meat, and something else, something that spoke of ancient traditions and a way of life completely foreign to Sarah's experience. Swift Eagle helped Thomas down from the horse, and immediately several women rushed forward. The eldest, her hair silver white and her face lined with wisdom, began examining Thomas's bandages with practiced hands. She spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, her tone both authoritative and concerned. White Dove, Thomas managed to say, his voice weak but reverent. She is our medicine woman. White Dove's dark eyes fixed on Sarah with penetrating intensity. The old woman spoke a few sharp words, and Swift Eagle translated reluctantly. She asks why a white woman tends to Cheyenne wounds. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting White Dove's gaze directly. Because he was dying, and I knew how to help. When Swift Eagle translated, White Dove's expression shifted subtly. She examined Thomas's shoulder again, then nodded once, a grudging acknowledgement of Sarah's skill. But her eyes remained wary. A crowd had gathered around them, faces illuminated by the dancing flames. Sarah felt the weight of their stares, heard the murmur of voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Emily pressed close to her side, while Grace buried her face in Sarah's skirt. Then, from the crowd, a young woman stepped forward. She was beautiful in a way that took Sarah's breath away, tall and graceful, with intricate beadwork adorning her deerskin dress and her black hair braided with feathers and small bones. When she looked at Thomas, her expression was one of deep concern mixed with something else. Love, Abigail, Thomas whispered, and Sarah felt something twist in her chest. Abigail knelt beside Thomas, her hands hovering over his bandaged shoulder. Without quite touching, she spoke to him in their language, her voice soft and melodic. Thomas responded weakly, and Sarah caught her own name in the flow of unfamiliar syllables. Abigail's eyes turned to Sarah, and for a moment the two women studied each other. There was no hostility in Abigail's gaze, but there was something else, a question, perhaps, or a challenge. You helped him, Abigail said in careful English, her accent making the words sound like music. Yes, Sarah replied simply. Why? The question hung in the air between them, around the fire. Conversations had quieted as people waited for Sarah's answer. Because, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly in the night air, when someone is dying and you have the power to help them, you help them. It doesn't matter who they are or where they come from. Abigail translated Sarah's words for the gathered crowd. There was a moment of silence. Then an old man near the fire began to speak. His voice was deep and resonant, and though Sarah couldn't understand his words, she could hear respect in his tone. He says, Swift Eagle translated, that you speak truth. A healer's heart knows no boundaries of blood or tribe. White Dove rose to her feet, her ancient joints creaking. She spoke briefly to Abigail, who nodded and turned back to Sarah. You will stay in my lodge tonight, Abigail said. You and your daughters, tomorrow. When Thomas is stronger, the council will decide what is to be done. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What is to be done? Whether you truly belong here, Abigail replied quietly, or whether you must go. Abigail's lodge was warm and inviting, filled with the soft glow of an oil lamp and the comforting scent of sweet grass, beautiful woven. Rugs covered the ground, and painted parfleches held what Sarah assumed were personal belongings. It was a home that spoke of care and tradition. Yet Sarah felt like an intruder in this intimate space. Your daughters are tired, Abigail observed, watching as Emily and Grace huddled together on the buffalo robes she had laid out for them. They've been through so much, Sarah said softly, smoothing Grace's hair as the little girl's eyes fluttered, closed. I keep wondering if I made the right choice, bringing them into the desert. Abigail settled cross-legged across from Sarah, her movements graceful and sure. You chose life over death. That is always the right choice. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the village settling for the night. Finally, Abigail spoke again. Thomas told Swift Eagle that you offered yourself as a slave to save your children. Sarah's cheeks burned with shame. I was desperate. They were dying. There is no shame in desperation when it comes from love, Abigail said gently. But I must ask you something, and I hope you will speak truthfully. Sarah met her eyes. Of course. Do you have feelings for Thomas? The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. She had been expecting hostility. Jealousy perhaps, but not this quiet curiosity. I'm grateful to him, Sarah said carefully. He saved our lives when he could have left us to die. That is not what I asked. Sarah looked down at her hands, rough and scarred from years of hard labor. I don't know, she admitted. I've been widowed for 3 years. I've forgotten what it feels like to care for someone that way. Abigail nodded thoughtfully. Thomas has been promised to me since we were children. It is the way of our people, marriages arranged to strengthen the tribe. But she trailed off, staring into the flickering flame of the oil lamp. But Sarah prompted gently. But I have watched him these past years, and I see that his heart is not in it. He honors the arrangement because it is expected, but there is no joy in his eyes when he looks at me. Abigail's voice was sad but not bitter. When Swift Eagle carried him into camp tonight, when he spoke your name, there was something different in his voice. Sarah felt her heart clench. Abigail, I never intended. I know. Abigail raised a hand to stop her. You saved his life without thought of reward. You asked for nothing but your daughter's safety. These are not the actions of a woman seeking to steal another's intended. Emily stirred in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Both women watched her for a moment, and Sarah felt the familiar fierce protectiveness rise in her chest. Tomorrow the council will decide our fate, Sarah said quietly. What will you tell them? Abigail was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her words surprised Sarah. I will tell them that you are a woman of honor, that you have healing, hands and a mother's heart, that the tribe would be stronger with you in it. Sarah stared at her in amazement. But Thomas, if Thomas's heart truly lies elsewhere, then it would be cruel of me to hold him to a promise made when we were children. Abigail's smile was sad but genuine. Besides, I have seen how Swift Eagle looks at me when he thinks no one is watching. Perhaps it is time for all of us to choose our own paths. Outside, the village drums had fallen silent, but Sarah's heart continued to race. Tomorrow would bring judgment, but tonight had brought something unexpected. A friend where she had feared to find an enemy. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Cheyenne village. Sarah woke to find Abigail already gone, leaving behind clean clothes, a simple deerskin dress, and moccasins that fit surprisingly well. Emily and Grace stirred as their mother dressed, both girls looking small and uncertain in the unfamiliar surroundings. Mama, what's going to happen today? Emily asked, her young voice tight with worry. Sarah knelt beside her daughters, taking their hands in hers. The tribal leaders will decide if we can stay here. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. A soft cough from the lodge entrance announced a visitor. Swift Eagle stood there, his expression serious but not unkind. "The council waits," he said simply. The meeting took place in the largest lodge at the village's center. 7 elders sat in a semicircle, their faces weathered by years and wisdom. At their center sat the chief, a man whose presence commanded immediate respect. White Dove sat to his right, her ancient eyes sharp and evaluating. Thomas was there too, propped up against a backrest but looking stronger than he had the night before. His eyes found Sarah's immediately, and she felt that strange flutter in her chest again. "Speak," the chief commanded, his English accented but clear. "Tell us why we should shelter the white woman and her children." Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind all night. But now, faced with the gravity of the situation, words seemed inadequate. "Honored chiefs," she began, her voice steady despite her fear, "I ask not for charity, but for the chance to earn my place among your people. I am skilled in healing. I proved this by saving Thomas's life. I can work, I can learn your ways. My daughters are young enough to grow up understanding both worlds." One of the elders spoke in Cheyenne, his tone skeptical. Swift Eagle translated. Reluctantly, he says, "White people have brought nothing but trouble to our lands." Sarah felt a flash of anger, but kept her voice calm. "I cannot speak for all white people. I can only speak for myself and my daughters. We seek only safety and the chance to build a new life. In return, I offer my skills and my loyalty." White Dove leaned forward, speaking directly to Sarah in broken English. "You tend Thomas' wounds. Good work. But why you come here? Why not your own people?" The question struck at the heart of Sarah's pain. "My own people enslaved me," she said quietly. "After my husband died, I was trapped in a life of servitude. I worked from dawn to dusk for barely enough food to keep my daughters alive. When I could bear no more, I fled into the desert, preferring death to slavery." Her words seemed to resonate with the council. Several elders nodded, understanding the desperation that drove people to extreme choices. Thomas struggled to sit straighter. "May I speak?" The chief nodded. "This woman saved my life when she could have left me to die," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the lodge. "She asked for nothing but protection for her children. She has proven herself worthy of our trust." Then, to Sarah's amazement, Abigail stepped forward from where she had been standing silently near the entrance. "I to speak for this woman," she declared. "She is skilled in healing, brave in the face of danger, and pure of heart. The spirits brought her to us for a reason." The chief studied Sarah for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight into her soul. Finally, he spoke. "You may stay through the winter, prove yourself worthy, and you may remain permanently. But know this: if you betray our trust, if you bring danger to our people, you will be cast out into the wilderness with nothing." Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will not disappoint you." The council was dismissed, but Sarah knew her real test was just beginning. The weeks that followed were both challenging and transformative. Sarah threw herself into learning the ways of the Cheyenne people with the same determination that had carried her through the desert. White Dove, despite her initial wariness, proved to be a patient teacher, showing Sarah how to identify healing plants and prepare traditional medicines. "This one," White Dove said, holding up a dried root, "good for fever, but too much." She made a gesture across her throat, indicating poison. Sarah nodded, carefully storing each piece of knowledge. Emily and Grace adapted more quickly than she did, their young minds absorbing the Cheyenne language with remarkable speed. Within a month, they were chattering with the other children, their laughter mixing seamlessly with the sounds of village life. Thomas recovered steadily under White Dove's care, and Sarah's continued attention to his wounds as his strength returned. He began teaching Sarah other skills: how to read the weather in the clouds, how to track animals by their footprints, how to navigate by the stars. Your people have forgotten how to listen to the earth, he said one evening as they walked along the creek that bordered the village. Everything they need to know is written in the wind, the water, the way the animals move. Sarah found herself drawn to these quiet moments with Thomas. Though she tried to maintain proper distance, Abigail had been nothing but kind to her, and the last thing Sarah wanted was to create conflict in the tribe that had welcomed them. But as autumn deepened into winter, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the growing connection between herself and Thomas. She would catch him watching her as she worked with the other women, and when their eyes met, something passed between them that went beyond gratitude or friendship. One snowy morning, as Sarah was helping White Dove prepare medicines, the old woman spoke without looking up from her work. Thomas looks at you the way a man looks at the sun after a long winter. Sarah's hands stilled in their grinding motion. White Dove, and you look at him the same way. The medicine woman continued calmly. But you fight it because you think it is wrong. Abigail is promised to him, Sarah said quietly. I won't come between them. White Dove finally looked up, her ancient eyes twinkling with something that might have been amusement. Child, do you think I am blind? Abigail's heart has wandered to Swift Eagle. She watches him the way the flowers watch the sun. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. Even so, I don't want to cause trouble, sometimes. White Dove said wisely, trouble finds us whether we want it or not. Her words proved prophetic. 3 days later, riders appeared on the horizon, not Cheyenne, but white men in military uniforms. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she recognized the lead figure, Colonel William James, Margaret Clayton's enforcer, a man known throughout Colorado for his cruelty and corruption. The village erupted into controlled chaos as the warriors prepared for potential conflict while the women and children moved to defensive positions. Thomas, still not fully recovered, but determined to protect his people, took his place among the defenders. Colonel James rode into the village with 6 soldiers, their rifles prominently displayed. He dismounted with deliberate arrogance, his pale eyes scanning the assembled Cheyenne until they fixed on Sarah. Mrs. Sarah Evans. He called out in a voice that carried across the village. You are under arrest for theft and kidnapping. Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Emily and Grace pressed close to her sides, their small hands clutching at her dress. I stole nothing, Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady. And these are my own daughters. James smiled coldly. Mrs. Margaret Clayton reports that you stole money and supplies before fleeing with her wards. Yes, Mrs. Evans, according to the court documents I carry. These children were placed in Mrs. Clayton's custody after your husband's death. The lie hit Sarah like a physical blow. But before she could respond, Thomas stepped forward, his hand resting on his knife handle. This woman is under our protection, he said quietly. You have no authority here. Colonel James's smile widened. Ah, but I do. This territory falls under federal jurisdiction, and I have every right to arrest a criminal and recover stolen property, including those children. The tension in the village was palpable as Colonel James's words hung in the cold winter air. Sarah felt the eyes of the entire tribe upon her, and for a moment, she wavered under the weight of their scrutiny. Had she brought danger to these people who had shown her nothing but kindness? But then Emily's small hand slipped into hers, and Grace pressed closer against her side. These were her daughters, not Margaret Clayton's wards, not property to be claimed by corrupt officials. Her children. Those documents are forgeries, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with each word. My daughters have never been anyone's wards but mine. Colonel James pulled out a leather portfolio, removing several official-looking papers. The court records say otherwise, Mrs. Evans. After your husband's death, you were deemed unfit to care for these children due to your circumstances. Mrs. Clayton graciously agreed to take them in. Lies, Sarah said flatly. Margaret Clayton is a slaver who preys on desperate women. She never had legal custody of my children. Can you prove that? James asked with mock concern. Do you have documentation of your fitness as a mother? Bank records showing your ability to provide for them? Character witnesses from your community? Sarah's heart sank. She had none of those things. Her life with Margaret had been deliberately isolated, designed to make her dependent and powerless. But then Thomas stepped closer, his presence a steadying force beside her. In our law, he said carefully, children belong with their mothers unless the mother is dead or has abandoned them. This woman has done neither. Colonel James laughed harshly. Your law has no standing here, savage. This is federal territory, and I have federal authority. The insult rippled through the assembled Cheyenne like wildfire. Several warriors reached for their weapons, but the chief raised his hand. Maintaining order through sheer force of will, you come to our village with guns and insults, the chief said, his English measured and dignified. You claim authority, but show no respect. Why should we listen to your words? Because, James replied, his hand moving to his pistol, I have the power to bring more soldiers, many more. Is sheltering one white woman worth the destruction of your entire village? The threat was clear, and Sarah felt sick at the thought that her presence might bring violence upon these people. She started to step forward, ready to sacrifice herself to protect them. But Abigail's voice cut through the tension. Wait, she called out, striding into the circle of confrontation. Colonel James, is it? I have heard your name before. James's eyes narrowed as they fixed on the beautiful Cheyenne woman. Have you now? Swift Eagle, Abigail called without taking her eyes off James. Tell him what the traitor said about Colonel James. When they came through last month, Swift Eagle stepped forward, his expression grim. They spoke of a man who sells government supplies to private buyers, who takes bribes to look the other way when settlers steal Indian land, a man who owns shares in several businesses, including one run by a woman named Margaret Clayton. Sarah gasped. The pieces fell into place like a puzzle completing itself. James wasn't just enforcing the law, he was protecting his investment. James's face darkened dangerously. You're treading on thin ice, boy. Am I? Swift Eagle replied calmly. Because I think the federal authorities in Denver would be very interested to hear about your business dealings, especially the ones involving falsified custody documents. For the first time since his arrival, Colonel James looked uncertain. Sarah seized the moment. You're not here to enforce justice, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the village. You're here to drag me back to your partner so she can continue profiting from my labor. But I won't go, Colonel, and neither will my daughters. James's hand tightened on his pistol grip. You don't have a choice. Yes, Thomas said quietly, moving to stand directly beside Sarah. She does, one by one. Other members of the tribe moved forward. Abigail, Swift Eagle, White Dove, even some of the younger warriors. They formed a protective circle around Sarah and her daughters, their message unmistakable. Colonel James looked around at the determined faces surrounding him and seemed to realize that his 6 soldiers were vastly outnumbered by warriors who knew this terrain intimately. This isn't over, he snarled, backing toward his horse. But Sarah had found something she had never possessed before, a community willing to fight for her. And for the first time since her husband's death, she truly believed that it might be enough. The days following Colonel James's retreat were filled with cautious celebration, but also preparation. The tribe scouts reported that James had not left the territory. Instead, he was camped 20 miles south with a growing number of soldiers. The threat hung over the village, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Sarah threw herself into helping with the preparations, working alongside the other women to preserve food and prepare supplies in case the village needed to move quickly. But beneath the surface activity, she was acutely aware of the changes happening around her. Thomas had barely left her side. Since the confrontation, his protective instincts clearly aroused. When she worked, he found reasons to be nearby. When she walked to the creek for water, he accompanied her. The attention was both comforting and confusing, especially given his engagement to Abigail. The resolution came. unexpectedly, on a quiet evening when Sarah was teaching Emily and Grace to be by the fire in Abigail's lodge. Abigail herself was working on a beautiful pair of moccasins, her nimble fingers creating intricate patterns in blue and white. "Those are lovely," Sarah commented, admiring the craftsmanship. Abigail smiled, holding up one of the moccasins. "Wedding gift," she said simply. Sarah's heart clenched, though she tried not to show it. "They're perfect. Thomas will treasure them." Abigail's hand stilled, and she looked up at Sarah with gentle amusement. "These are not for Thomas, though," Sarah said, confused. "Then who?" "Swift Eagle," Abigail said quietly, her cheeks coloring slightly. "I spoke with the elders today. The engagement between Thomas and myself has been dissolved." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her. "Abigail, if I have caused problems between you, you have caused nothing," Abigail interrupted firmly. "You have simply helped us all see what was already true. Thomas's heart has never been mine, and mine has wandered to another. We were children when that promise was made. We are not children anymore." Emily looked up from her beating. "Does this mean Mr. Thomas can marry Mama?" "Emily," Sarah gasped, mortified. But Abigail laughed, the sound like silver bells. "From the mouths of children comes great wisdom." Before Sarah could respond, the lodge flap opened and Thomas stepped inside, snowflakes dusting his dark hair. His eyes went immediately to Sarah, then to Abigail. "I heard," he said simply, "about the engagement." Abigail rose gracefully, gathering her beadwork. "Come, girls," she said to Emily and Grace. "Let's visit Swift Eagle's sister. She has puppies that need playing with." The girls needed no further encouragement. Following Abigail out into the snowy evening and leaving Sarah alone with Thomas for a moment, neither spoke. Thomas moved closer to the fire, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. "Are you angry?" she finally asked. "About the engagement ending?" Thomas was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "I have been angry for many things in my life," he said. "My parents' deaths, the loss of our hunting grounds, the way white soldiers treat my people. But this is not one of those things." He knelt beside her, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his dark eyes. "Sarah," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "When I found you in the desert, I thought the spirits had sent me someone to save. I did not know they had sent me someone to save me." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas, I love you," he said simply. "I love your courage, your kindness, your fierce protection of your daughters. I love the way you tend wounds with gentle hands and the way you stand up to corrupt men with rifles. I love you, and if you will have me, I want to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that love." Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks, tears of joy, of relief, of a hope she had thought lost forever. "Yes," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. "Yes, Thomas, I love you too." When he kissed her, it felt like coming home. Spring came early to the Colorado plains, bringing with it both hope and the return of Colonel James. This time, he arrived with nearly 50 soldiers, their blue uniforms stark against the green grass of the awakening prairie. The message was clear. He would not be denied again. Sarah stood with Thomas at the edge of the village, watching the approaching cavalry with a mixture of fear and determination. Over the winter months, she had grown stronger, more confident. In her place among the Cheyenne, she had learned their ways, contributed to their community, and found love she had never thought possible. She would not let James destroy what they had built. "He brings an army this time," Thomas observed grimly. "Then we must be smarter than an army," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. The tribal council had met through the night, debating their options. They could fight, but against 50 armed soldiers, the cost would be devastating. They could flee, but James would only follow. Or they could try a different approach, one that Sarah had proposed with a desperation born of love for her new family. When James rode into the village this time, he found not the defensive preparations he expected, but what appeared to be a celebration. Colorful banners flew from the lodge poles, and the smell of roasted meat filled the air. Children played in the sunshine while women worked at their daily tasks with seeming unconcern. "What is the meaning of this?" James demanded as he dismounted, his hand resting on his saber. The chief stepped forward, resplendent in his ceremonial regalia. "We celebrate the spring return of life to the earth. You are welcome to join us, Colonel James." James's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "I'm not here for your heathen festivities. I'm here for Sarah Evans and those children." "Of course," the chief replied with grave courtesy. "Sarah Evans will speak with you. But first, you must hear what Swift Eagle has learned in his travels to Denver." Sarah's heart pounded as Swift Eagle emerged from the crowd, carrying a leather satchel. Over the winter, he had made the dangerous journey to the territorial capital, armed with information and a desperate plan. "Colonel James," Swift Eagle said formally, "I bring greetings from Federal Marshal Robert Hayes." James's face went pale at the mention of the marshal's name. "What are you talking about?" Swift Eagle opened the satchel and withdrew several official documents. "Marshal Hayes was very interested to learn about your business partnership with Margaret Clayton, especially the part where you've been using forged custody papers to supply her with forced labor." "You have no proof, actually," Sarah interrupted, stepping forward with her own papers. "We do. Over the winter, with the help of a sympathetic trader who made regular runs to Denver, Sarah had managed to obtain copies of the real court records from her husband's death. The documents clearly showed that no custody hearing had ever taken place, that her daughters had never been placed in anyone's care. These are the genuine records," Sarah continued, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "They prove that Margaret Clayton never had legal custody of my daughters, which means your documents are forgeries." James's hand moved to his pistol, but found himself surrounded not just by Cheyenne warriors, but by his own soldiers who were now looking at their commanding officer with suspicion and disgust. "Furthermore," Swift Eagle continued, "Marshal Hayes has issued warrants for both your arrest and Mrs. Clayton's. She was arrested last week on charges of human trafficking and fraud. She's already confessed to the forgery scheme in exchange for a reduced sentence." The color drained from James's face completely. Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with pity. Margaret Clayton's empire of exploitation had finally crumbled. "You have two choices, Colonel," Thomas said quietly, moving to stand beside Sarah. "You can surrender peacefully to the federal authorities, or you can resist and face the consequences. But either way, Sarah Evans and her daughters are staying here, where they belong." James looked around at the circle of determined faces, Cheyenne and white soldiers alike, all united against corruption and cruelty. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "Sergeant Miller," he called to one of his men, "place me under arrest." As the soldiers led James away, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had carried for years. The threat was over. They were truly free. Thomas's hand found hers, warm and strong and full of promise. "It's finished," he said softly. Sarah smiled, watching Emily and Grace play with the other children in the sunshine. "No," she said, "it's just beginning." 5 years had passed since that spring day when Colonel James rode away in shackles, and the valley had transformed into something beautiful beyond Sarah's wildest dreams. What had once been a place of refuge had become a bridge between two worlds, a living testament to the power of understanding and cooperation. Sarah stood on the hill overlooking the expanded village, watching as Emily and Grace, now 14 and 12, moved effortlessly between English and Cheyenne. As they helped coordinate the weekly trading gathering, white settlers and Cheyenne families mingled freely in the market area, exchanging goods, stories, and laughter. Her daughters had grown into confident young women who served as natural translators and peacekeepers, their childhood in both worlds making them invaluable ambassadors. The morning council went well, Thomas said, joining her on the hill. His hair was now streaked with silver at the temples, and laugh lines crinkled around his eyes. The territorial governor has agreed to officially recognize our trading post. We'll have federal protection for all merchants who come here. Sarah leaned into her husband's embrace, still marveling at how the word felt. They had married in a ceremony that honored both Cheyenne and Christian traditions, with Abigail and Swift Eagle married themselves the following spring, standing as witnesses. The memory still filled her with warmth. White Dove says the healing lodge is ready for its first group of student healers, Sarah reported. Women from 3 different tribes want to learn our combined methods. Over the years, Sarah had worked closely with White Dove to create a new approach to medicine that blended traditional Cheyenne healing with European techniques. The results had been remarkable, and word of their success had spread far beyond the valley. The old medicine woman, now in her 80s but still sharp as winter air, had insisted that the knowledge be shared freely. And the school, Thomas asked. Emily has 15 students enrolled for the fall session. Sarah replied proudly. Both Cheyenne and white children learning together. The school had been Emily's idea, proposed when she was only 11, but spoken with the wisdom of someone much older. She had argued that education was the key to preventing future conflicts, and her passion had convinced even the most skeptical tribal elders. Now she taught children to read and write in both languages, while Grace had developed a talent for storytelling that preserved oral traditions for future generations. A commotion in the village below caught their attention. A wagon train was arriving, not the usual traders, but families with packed belongings and tired faces. Refugees, Sarah realized, fleeing some hardship in the outside world. More people seeking safety, Thomas observed without judgment. Sarah nodded. Over the years, they had welcomed many such groups, former slaves fleeing north, families ruined by economic disasters, widows with children, and nowhere else to turn. The valley had grown to accommodate them all, becoming a place where anyone willing to work and live in peace could find a home. I should go help them get settled, Sarah said. But Thomas caught her hand. In a moment, he said softly, I want to remember this. Sarah followed his gaze across the valley. Smoke rose from dozens of lodges and cabins, representing families from different backgrounds who had learned to live as one community. Children played games that combined traditions from multiple cultures. Gardens flourished where both corn and wheat grew side by side. Do you ever miss it? Thomas asked quietly. Your old life. Sarah thought of the terrified woman who had offered herself as a slave in the desert, of the desperate mother who had fled into the wilderness with nothing but hope. That woman seemed like someone from another lifetime. No, she said firmly. That wasn't living. This is living. Emily's laughter drifted up from the village below, followed by Grace's giggle and the sound of other children joining in. Thomas squeezed Sarah's hand, and she squeezed back, feeling the calluses that marked his years of hard work alongside her own. Come, she said, starting down the hill toward the newcomers. Let's go welcome them home. As they walked hand in hand toward the village, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had begun as a woman with nothing to offer but desperation and a mother's love. Now she was a healer, a teacher, a leader in a community that thrived on acceptance and mutual respect. The desert had nearly claimed her life, but in saving Thomas, she had found something more precious than survival. She had found purpose, love, and a legacy that would outlive them all. In the distance, the evening star appeared in the deepening sky, bright with promise for tomorrow.